This is Hampshire, one of the most prosperous parts of England. Average house prices are over 400,000. But Hampshire County Council has the largest deficit in the UK. It is at risk of bankruptcy. The council is spending more, but residents appear to be getting less. In 2011, the council spent 52% of its budget on social care. Now it's over 83%. It means that old-fashioned local council services that are widely used, like libraries, street lightings, even lollipop ladies, are being cut. It seems governments are getting bigger, but can do fewer useful things. In 1975, 95% of government housing expenditure was on building new homes, and just 5% on benefits. In 2022, it's just 12% on building new homes, with 26 billion going on housing benefits. Building council houses was an effective use of public money. It provided affordable homes. But we stopped doing it in the early 1980s. Since then, house prices and rents have soared. But this has become very expensive for the government. The government has to spend more on housing benefits so people can afford to live. And it would have been even more if it hadn't introduced a two-child cap, which has caused increase in child poverty rates. But the combination of rising rents and squeezing benefits has caused a significant rise in homelessness, which of course falls to local councils to have to deal with, and it's very expensive to provide temporary accommodation. Last year, local councils in the UK spent over £2 billion on dealing with the problem of homelessness. It is this kind of crisis management that is squeezing more popular areas of government spending, like providing parks, infrastructure, and actually building new homes. The UK is not an isolated case. Across the Western world, governments are getting bigger, but it has been driven by a rise in pensions and social spending. Voters are increasingly frustrated because they see taxes go up, but the quality of services seemingly decline. In the UK, taxes as a share of GDP have been rising in the past decade. But the problem is they haven't been rising enough to meet the spending requirements of important government services. The most important priority in the UK is healthcare. People really value being able to see the doctor. Yet waiting lists have passed 7 million, and people often find it difficult to get an appointment. The biggest cause of this global trend in higher government spending is an ageing population. In the post-war period, Western governments set up pensions, welfare states, universal healthcare. But there was hardly ever investment in any kind of pension fund, just a reliance on economic growth to provide higher tax. But now, there are three major problems to this model. Firstly, people are living longer and having fewer children. It means the share of people in retirement is growing. Governments have to pay more pensions from a smaller workforce. Entitlement spending is rising, whether it's the UK or the US. Secondly, healthcare spending has soared faster than economic growth without being able to keep a lid on waiting lists. In 1990, the UK spent £700 per capita on healthcare. Today it is £2,800, and that's real terms adjusted for inflation. But despite this higher spending, the quality of healthcare and waiting lists are not improving. There are more expensive treatments, people live longer and need more treatment in their old age, but also there's been an increase in sickness of working age people needing treatment too. Despite squeezing the wages of medical staff, there's been a failure to keep lid on costs and improve productivity. For many reasons, productivity in the healthcare sector has been growing quite slowly, so spending rises but outcomes don't seem to improve. Now, to some extent, you could point a finger at government bureaucracy and the new layers of management, but also bear in mind the US, with its semi-private system, spends double the amount of healthcare than the UK, yet for all its healthcare spending, life expectancy in the US has fallen behind many other economies. So it's not just government who are struggling to get value for money from healthcare. The bad news is that we're only at the start of this demographic crunch. Recent data on birth rates show that UK fertility is falling once again. The ONS has been frequently wrong about population forecasts. Recent data shows UK fertility rates fell to just 1.44, so the share of people over 65 will continue to grow, and so will spending on pensions. The OBR claim that on current policy, government spending will rise to 55% of GDP. The problem is that even if the government maintain their current policies, they don't necessarily get too much credit. If we work all life, we expect to get a pension at the end of it. But this rise in entitlement spending is crowding out other areas of public spending. The government share of spending on research and development has declined from 17% to just 8%. Public investment in the UK has been squeezed in the past 2 decades. In the post-war period, it was often over 4-5% of GDP. Now it struggles to reach just 2% of GDP. And this damages long-term economic growth. But when governments are squeezed by this entitlement spending, it's more tempting to cut public investment. Now, there is more to this problem than just demographics. You could argue the growing scope of governments has brought more regulatory overreach. Planning regulations can impose ever higher costs on investment. The new Thames crossing has cost over £800 million on the planning process, and there's no guarantee it will be even built. The planning process runs to over 400,000 pages. If you printed it out, it would be longer than the tunnel itself. In East Dunbartonshire, 15 new council houses will cost £8 million to build because of new regulations and high cost of building. It's no wonder councils are not building new houses. And let's not mention HS2. In this regard, the UK is particularly bad in the high cost of building compared to other countries. Milton Friedman once quipped, there is no such thing as temporary government spending. Temporary soon becomes permanent. In the 1930s, the US brought in subsidies for farmers who were struggling in the Great Depression. But over the next few decades, subsidies to farmers just kept growing. It was in no one's political interests to take it away. US agricultural subsidies now account for around $25 billion a year. It's the same in Europe, where the EU has spent the past 30-40 years trying to undo the damage of a common agricultural policy. Now, the current Labour government made an effort to tackle long-term rise in spending on pension benefits by means testing winter fuel allowances. But despite saving only around £1 billion, which is really a drop in the ocean compared to future spending, there was a big political backlash. Once benefits are there, people don't want to lose them. A big problem for the UK in the past decade or so is the underfunding of social care. It's why so many councils have been squeezed and councils facing bankruptcy. They have a legal requirement to provide care, but not the funds. In 2019, Theresa May introduced a manifesto policy to fund social care by using the value of people's homes that they owned. In the words of Yes Minister, it was a very courageous policy. It was soon labelled the dementia tax, and she nearly lost the election to Jeremy Corbyn. No wonder difficult decisions are delayed to some time in the future. So what does the government actually spend its money on? Where is all your tax going? In 2022-23, the UK spent a total of £1.2 trillion. The biggest areas of government spending are healthcare, pensions and working age benefits. The fourth largest is debt interest payments. And out of interest, things like spending on the Ukraine war or MP salaries, overseas aid, very small fraction of total spending. And this debt interest payment, though, is a problem because it's grown a lot in the past couple of years because of higher inflation, higher interest rates and rising debt. The result is we're paying over £100 billion a year just on debt interest payments. And it's not just a UK phenomenon. US debt is soaring as a share of GDP to record levels, and it's going to keep rising. In the upcoming presidential election, Trump's policies will increase US national debt by around $7.7 trillion. Harris's policy increased the debt by a mere $4 trillion. It was only 30 years ago the US was running budget surpluses. Hard to imagine today. The other unwelcome reality that explains a lot of the problems governments face and households face is that economic growth has been slowing down. This is the rate of expected growth in the Eurozone. There's a similar downward trend in the UK. The one exception, by the way, is the United States. In the post-war period, the UK used to have growth of around 2.5% a year. But since the financial crisis in 2009, we've had barely any increase in per capita growth at all. And this is a real headache for everybody because it's why taxes have been rising without any seeming improvement in public services. In the post-war period, because of high growth, we could spend more, reduce debt, and living standards improved. Has that golden period come to an end? Well, I think it's worth pointing out that a growing size of a government spending doesn't have to be a failure. We could perhaps look at the Scandinavian model, where there's higher government spending, higher tax as a share of GDP, but relative satisfaction. If we look at Denmark, government spending as a share of GDP is higher, but VAT is 25% as opposed to 20%. But it's not just about spending more. The Danish healthcare system is helped by a state-of-the-art IT system. It also uses a health ID card. But most importantly, perhaps, around 88% in a Gallup poll were happy to pay the high tax levels because they feel they get value for money. Denmark's not a socialist economy. It's market-based, but a welfare state which is quite extensive. I think that the problem for the UK is a creeping rise in government spending, but never enough to really make things work. If we want to keep more US tax levels, the only real solution is going to be paying many thousands of pounds on private health insurance like we do in the US. In fact, I was fascinated by how bad US life expectancy is. How can the richest country in the world, which spends by far the most on healthcare, have such dismal life expectancy? I enjoyed making this video, which looks at this problem in more detail.